Okay, so I suppose there we have a breakdown of the three sections, capturing outfield teaching in the first instance, some of the contributory factors that we know to date. The second section is going to be, I suppose, a little bit more subject specific, and finally, I'm just looking at the chat there as well. Finally, then the book looks for ideas of practical implications, actions which you across different countries to address the outfield situation. Helen, do I understand right that the focus is thus how teachers adapt to become in field? That will be, I imagine in particular, part 2 and part 3 will look at that, all right, and it's something open for debate. How we want to phrase part 2. Is it specifically for teachers, or is it for more broadly, I suppose, policymakers, management, academics? So we can look at that when we come to it. I don't know if that, Linda, do you want to come in on that in any way, or have I missed anything there?
Yeah, I think maybe we'll have a look at each of the sections in a little bit, but overall, we're looking at the implications of out of field and how the systems are responding to it, rather than necessarily just describing the experiences for individual teachers, looking at that in the context of response to out of field. Edith, you've got a question?
Yeah, I was trying to. I was wondering, there is a sentence, how teachers and principals react to the situation, in the second paragraph. Did you consider also including professional development providers or something larger than the school itself?
Yeah, definitely. It's particularly the last section, and the second section will, I think, be looking at measures that how to support out of field teachers and the various ways the parts of the ecosystem sort of do that. And responding to Helen's question in the chat too, the notion of becoming in field is a funny one, and it's quite different, of course, in different systems. So whether maybe some of it is about supporting this to become in field through maybe formal qualification and requalifying, but it's also about how we can support the sustaining of quality teaching, even in the context of teaching out of field. In Margaret's words, how they might be successful as an out of field teacher. So I think we'd be looking at that full range of response, both by the teacher as they're supported and also by those within the system.
Yeah, so 4 sections as it currently stands. Each section concludes with a synthesis to highlight key messages from the given section and develop signposts for the following section. So section 1, led by Linda and Rafaela, out of field teaching conceptualized and contextualized. I suppose foregrounding ahead of the next sections in the book. Then want to try and see what we have from, as I suppose, research in the last, would we say maybe 5 to 10 years has begun to flow out into different subject areas. Can we bring that together now in one section? So out of field teaching different subjects, what we know from research. And again, it's all tentative in terms of the titles and so on. Section 3 then, led by Susan, practical implications of and actions in responses to teaching out of field. And finally then section 4 will look at understanding the implications of what we know to date and moving forward with responses.
So the first section is looking at that conceptualizing what it means and understanding the context that it's occurring in. So we're sort of looking at 3 different chapters or groupings of chapters. The first being that it's looking at how out of field teaching is conceptualized, and there has been some work done around that. And it sort of depends on the system as well as to how that is then operationalized. And then we'll have some additional chapters looking at the nature of the disciplines and how different subjects reflect different disciplinary practices. So that's foregrounding, particularly what comes in section 2, just understanding the nature of the disciplines. And there was a a chapter in our first book that looked at the subject specific nature of teaching. So it won't be that, obviously. It'll be looking at how disciplinary knowledge practices sort of play out and are translated into school subjects, and then how that how we understand the implications of that for out-of-field teachers. And then the last chapter or section of or groupings of chapters would be looking at the different teacher education systems, basically having a look at the country comparison, looking at the discourses around the situation, and the various reasons why teaching out of field occurs in those different contexts. Again, I think we've had something like that in some of our different texts, and I think we'll come up with a structure for sort of pulling those together, whether it's one chapter that's quite large and just a little bit of understanding, or whether, depending on which countries and which contexts we want to talk about, it might be multiple chapters. So this is sort of the structure then. We don't want this front part to be too large. Once you start talking about 10 different countries, if each of them have got 5 pages each, I mean, that's 50 pages, and that's, you know, that's a quarter of a book. So we sort of have to be a little bit careful around how we use this first section, and that it is just setting up the rest of the book, as Stephen has indicated. So we'd probably have one chapter for that conceptualization, and we're looking for authors who can help to sort of frame that conceptualization. Some of those words probably sound like they've come from me because I probably wrote it, but, you know, things are always better when you bring multiple perspectives in. So looking for people who are willing to assist with that conceptualization. The disciplines and school subjects, so we're looking to look at those realms of knowledge, practices that translate, as I'd indicated, so a single chapter there. And then the last section, maybe multiple chapters, or it maybe more. So more, or it might just be one. So basically for those B and C, we're looking for people who'd like to contribute their conceptualization and understanding about disciplines and school subjects. And then in C, looking at who would like to write about their particular context. So do you want to write about Germany? Do you want to write about Israel? Do you want to write about New Zealand? Just to help bring those country, I guess, case studies together into this chapter. So if it's one chapter, it would be 7,000 or 8,000. So you might want to consider how you can, how you might want to contribute to that. If there's multiple people who want to write about Germany, then we would bring you together to write one section or one part of that. So what we're sort of hoping to do through this section 1 and 2 is actually bring author teams together where there is common ideas or complementary ideas that make sense to bring together. So, and then as with all of the different sections, we're going to have a synthesis and we'll sort of pull that together. Now, Jill's asked the question, when you say country, that is changing in locations such as Australia and Germany with localised curriculum and policies. But even in Australia, we've got such variation within the one country, and a lot of countries have that variation as well. So you'd be wanting to capture some of that variation within it. So, so localised curriculum, yeah. So what are the teacher education pathways and certification practices? What discourses exist relating to teaching out of field, and what statistics exist in relation to the prevalence of teaching out of field? So that's what will go into that, Jill. So if we were to write about Australia together, for example, we'd be wanting to respond to each of those 3 points. Marcel.
I think with your last sentence, you've just answered my question, because I wanted to ask, if we wanted to write something for section 1, would we have to cover A, B, and C, or just B, or just B and C? What's the idea?
Yeah, no, good point. So when you go into the expression of interest, you'll see that you can contribute to any of those. Just one of those would be fine. So these will be separate chapters. We're looking for different author teams in each of those different subsections. Yeah, so this is accessible from the OOFTAS website. You can get to it from events. And down here, you can click on the heading and it brings to this website, and the information that's on this PowerPoint's here actually for you to look at later. So this is section 1, and these are the 3 books. And basically I've said for each of the sections, do you want to contribute to that? Yes or no? And they're actually forced questions. So you might only want to contribute to section 1. So you write yes there, and then no for section 2 and no for section 3. For section 1, then so if you wanted to contribute to the conceptualization of out-of-teaching, so thinking around how could you contribute a chapter on that, contribute to a chapter, and then the same with the disciplines of school. How could you contribute to a single chapter on understanding how disciplines create realms of knowledge that are translated into school subjects? And then the last one, those 3 points there. If you wanted to contribute here, how could you contribute to a chapter that describes your national context according to the above 3 questions? Now, you may even make an argument that my context, my state is so different to the rest of the country that I think it needs to be dealt with separately. So if you want to make that case, you can do that as well.
Okay, so section 2 then takes a subject-specific approach to examining out-of-field teaching phenomenon. This involves exploring the research relating to teaching. Either it can be any, it'll depend on what people are available and what you have at your disposal for the subject area. So these are just the subjects mentioned here are just some examples of what we've seen in the literature to date. But if you bring forward a different area, that would be fantastic too. Looking at what's available so far and what's been published, there are maybe mathematics and science has maybe how should I say, a more in-depth empirical research base at the moment. So it might be that teams come together from different countries or different areas, maybe that haven't worked previously in those subject areas to form one chapter. It may be the case. So anyway, some of the ideas are the geography, science, physics and chemistry. It could be within that or separate chapters, home ec, physical education, English out of field, English foreign language subject. So whichever people want to bring forward, we're only too welcoming to have that. So the idea is kind of that each chapter focuses on one subject. Documenting the requirements to obtain certification, it could be, or the education or the training undertaken, depending on your jurisdiction or various jurisdictions, to teach the subject, and then to capture the subject culture. So looking at this through the lens of prevailing subject paradigms, what should be taught, or in your context, what is deemed that is necessary to be taught as part of the subject, and the subject pedagogies, how the subject should be taught. So I'm coming from this from a mathematical lens, so therefore I may be failing to capture what's in other subject areas. So we want to keep this broad enough that all chapters can speak to the same points. So we kind of follow a similar template that you could pick it up and read about one subject, read about a different subject area, and so on. If possible, the last part is each chapter concludes with a presentation of a vignette on a teacher or teachers teaching the subject out of field, capturing the complex enculturation process that out-of-field teachers encounter as they teach a subject outside their field of expertise. Now, that may not be always possible for every subject area. So again, we'll see what we have, and we're at the early draft stages here. So yeah, if we could, Lynn, you can move on. Okay, so the idea is a possible chapter framing, a template that we could speak to in this section, comes from Grossman and Stadolsky in addition to Jean Lavey. So focus on school subjects as specific contexts within which secondary school teachers teach. And we want to capture the arena, which is features of school subjects. So curricular control, coordination, coverage. So larger institutions, which though socially constructed, have given a set of features that both enable and constrain certain activities. The status of different subject areas, the histories of how different subject areas have come to be. Now, there's a lot to capture here, so you mightn't talk to all of this. Again, it's just a general idea under this larger framing that each subject could talk to. So, for instance, in mathematics, status, it's deemed in Ireland, for instance, it has greater points go towards third level, so it's a gatekeeper subject. Sequentiality, it's, each year builds on curriculum from previous year and so on, but that mightn't be the case in other subject areas in how their scope of the subject and so on, so you might talk to that. And then the setting, so Lave's description of context looks at arena in a broader sense, and then setting to account for the individually constructed and represented version of the arena. So each subject had a kind of a subject subculture, beliefs and norms which frame practices. So if Linda, if you just tap enter for one second.
Oh.
Yeah, so shared beliefs and norms of teachers who teach a subject can be categorized as a subject subculture. Teachers can share or differ in their interpretations of the subject. So maybe we have some data to talk about in-field or out-of-field teachers of the subject. For example, in a mathematics context, a shared belief around there's the norms of traditional mathematics teaching, which is tell and drill, capturing that, or there's norms around reform-oriented teaching, which is more active learning, problem-solving based type teaching. So capturing, in the first sense, the arena is kind of like the subject itself and its essence. And the second part then will look at the pedagogies towards teaching the subject. Yeah, we can move on.
Just on that, I wondered, it probably would make sense to capture diversity of views and tensions and, and contradictions that are occurring within the field, that there is not just one subject subculture, even within the broader field. For example, if in English. Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, in the math sense, there's that conflict between traditional tell and drill teaching and reform oriented. So like to try and capture those. So the kind of questions that you'd look at per chapter: what is the subject in focus? What are the routes to be certified to teach the subject? What are the prevailing principles underpinning teacher education in the subject? How is there an emphasis on content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge? How is it determined? What are the prevailing subject paradigms? So the views of the discipline as a subject held by subject teachers in terms of what's appropriate content, so the curriculum areas. Then what are the prevailing subject pedagogies? And as pointed out there, plural. So what are the system of ideas and procedures for the organization of learning in the classroom under specific conditions? What are the teaching practices, figured worlds, shared beliefs, norms? And then are there vignettes available from research on teachers teaching the subject out of field? So looking at what do we learn from the vignettes about out-of-field teachers in relation to the prevailing subject paradigms and pedagogies, adherence, non-adherence, challenges with that, and then how do they attempt to overcome the challenges? What supports need to be made available for teachers to overcome them when teaching this subject? And finally, then we'd finish with section B, which would be a synthesis. So the first part, 1 to 4, would look to try and capture the arena context as described in the framing. And the second part would look at that setting more, I suppose, individuals have different responses depending on in relation to the arena. So you can flick on 2 more there, Linda. So that would be the arena section. Right. And this second part, these questions would address the setting. Again, just a way to frame all of the chapters in a broader sense. So some considerations that we would need to take into account, what is the target audience? If it's teachers, are we looking at it in the sense of, you can keep moving on one by one. Yeah, thank you very much, Linda. Insights on teaching the subject and recommendations and considerations for teaching the subject out of field. Or it could also be, your chapter could be pointed towards policymakers, school management, or other bodies. So the nuances of a subject, capturing that, and then illustrations of teaching the subject out of field, the practices, the challenges, the supports required. And then we can keep flicking on. So those nuances of a subject, or the insights on this subject or teaching the subject, we'd look at that kind of subject arena on a larger scale. And then they would look at kind of prevailing paradigms, and the recommendations for teaching the subject out of field or the illustrations of practice would be more the individual, the subject settings, and capturing the prevailing pedagogies. Oh yes, just the status, time, assessment. I touch these when you're talking about subject arena, curricular autonomy, the scope, sequentiality of the subject, and then the shared settings, shared beliefs, norms of practice. So that's what we try and capture within those areas. Yeah. So that would what each of the chapters, you know, again, this is all tentative, so there might be objections to this. That's perfectly fine. It might not suit. It's only something to bring forward to frame our thinking around your subject area and then data that you have. So it was just that, I suppose, across the chapters, if there was a coherency about how each chapter deals with their subject area as a frame of reference, it could be helpful. But again, if the authors of a particular chapter came back and said we can't write towards this, well then that, you know, we could definitely adapt as we see fit. Or
and it's I think the insights, recommendations, the nuances, and illustrations. That's, I think, where the commonalities, the common structure is. You don't have to use the words that are provided, I think, by the theory itself, but maybe that's a good way of thinking about it. I think this will be really fruitful to underpin discussions by various authors in the one subject. You know, if one person was to write it, it would be fine. But I think bringing multiple people together and to discuss these things, I think will be really really powerful. So thanks.
And how they differ perhaps across context. To capture that too. Yeah. Very good.
Context as in different countries. Different
countries, jurisdiction.
And so the trick's going to be in the part B of that section then, Stephen, to sort of maybe pull out some commonalities or, you know, some threads that are interesting to look at across the different subjects.
So what subjects you have, you know, which of the following you address? As you said, there's a lot there. It's to be taken as just a framing at this point to help guide your thinking. But if your thinking is already going a particular direction, that feel free to run with that. Which you'd like to discuss there, and then how you'd address these.
And I think it's really useful. Say if Jill put one in and ticked, you know, the first two and the last two, then maybe someone else from maths might tick some of the others. And so we know that it'd be quite complementary author team by doing that.
That would be, I would say, best case scenario to bring together different points of view and so on.
Okay, my slides are not quite as elaborate as Stephen's. I feel a bit embarrassed now, actually. But for my section, really having a look, doesn't matter what sort of your subject or your context is, it might be working across sort of experiences, so to speak, or a group of teachers rather than being subject specific, but really focusing on what the implications are for teaching out of field, for, you know, those who are doing it, perhaps for the students, maybe school leadership teams, obviously policy and decision makers, all those sorts of things, the whole realm of implications that your research might be addressing. And then actions that are arising in response to the requirement for, you know, in-service and also pre-service teachers to teach out of field. So for section 3, I'd really like this to be founded sort of in empirical work that's currently happening around the world. As you've probably picked up in the previous sections, it can be a mixture of both empirical work, commentaries, systematic reviews, and so on. There can be a range of approaches taken, where in section 3, I think to have that empirical story about actions that are happening as a response to teaching out of field, and you know, identification of and addressing implications could be quite powerful. Obviously, from school-based and non-school-based settings, including is not a definitive list, it's just an example to get us started. you know, English teacher education also in schools. It might be obviously within professional associations who might be working in more in the professional development realm. It doesn't matter where that research is sort of coming from, and really looking at this idea about how, whether it's, you know, case study approaches or teams or however you look at it, sort of navigate this idea of teaching out of field. How do they manage it? How do they respond to it? And so then on the next slide, again, for the idea of coherency, and this is not fixed either, but it's about trying to find a common theme that we can thread towards through the chapters in section 3. Sort of saying, putting forward ideas that you might like to attach, or your work might already be attached to aspects of culture, time, and the boundaries. So your behaviours and beliefs and practice, obviously culture of people and place. With time, obviously, you know, this can be those one-off short, sharp captures of once-off moments in time. So for some of us, it might also be more longitudinal and phases of time. And then to consider where these boundaries are they working in silos? Are there sort of cross-fertilization, working across the boundaries? So whether it's the individual, then perhaps with the institution or the schools or the various sort of setting, and then looking at the policies that surround that. So I guess as a way of finding a line of sight through these chapters about implications and actions, if there's aspects of these elements that you can sort of highlight in your work, that at the moment is seen as the thread through. Being sort of based in the empirical work and research that's happening, a fairly traditional chapter structure in terms of, you know, stating the problem, research question, literature review, the framework using to sort of analyse data, methodology, results and discussion, and then obviously a conclusionary statement that's looking towards the what next as well. There's some questions here as I guess sort of prompters for thinking, not that I expect that you know, all questions would be addressed. Some of you might cut across a couple of questions depending on the research that's happening. Some of you might sit firmly within one of these questions. Others of you, it might be a hybrid of a couple of questions here that we chunk together. And of course, these questions here are not definitive. They're just opportunities to prompt thinking and think about whether research that you're currently working in at the moment or have just completed would sort of fit in this space. So looking at teachers across the career stages, how do they you know, encounter and respond to out of field teaching? For those of us who might be working more deeply within initial teacher education itself, I know there's research happening around the role of professional associations in particular. There might be those in stakeholder groups that sit a little bit more outside the school setting. Then of course, I guess things like, you know, classroom readiness, profession readiness, what does this mean in sort of the out of field teaching domain, partnerships, implications for accreditation. These are just ideas to get us started with, you know, ideas about whether your research, you know, could be a good fit for section 3. You know, if you've got questions about which section of this book do I go to, this might help. And then of course the synthesis at the end, where we bring those common threads together. Implications for instructional practice and teacher professional development, absolutely, yeah.
I think that say if someone was to do a literature review, like a systematic review of professional development, for example, would that fit into section 3 as well?
Whilst I would like to see the empirical work really profiled here, I don't want to also be exclusive, just want to put ideas out there to prompt thinking at the moment. And if a systematic review around this is where it best fits, perhaps, or even as a scene setter for this section, then yeah, I'm open to that.
So that should look familiar. Are there those points that you mentioned too? And that what will be your argument, I guess, Susan, is just, you know, what are the key things that you're looking at? Maybe describe the focus of the analysis. Yeah, maybe I should reframe that. not say what will be your argument.
Yeah.
So Edith's question, does in-service teacher education programs fit in section 3? I would say definitely. Yeah, so they're requalification courses that you're talking about, Edith.
If we decided to contribute to chapter 1, be it A, B, or C, would we be expected to describe the situation in the country, or would this be more like a federal state phenomenon, or what's the scope with regard to section 1?
So down here for C, which is looking at the teacher education context or the teacher context, yeah. Well, that I think it might depend on how many people want to talk about Germany, and what the people want to say. Because I would like to think that the author teams, once they've been decided, have some degree of autonomy as to what goes in there. And certainly that the C is, that's a bit of a wait and see bucket, because it really depends on which countries are put forward. We might see some gaps and we might tap some people on the shoulder if we feel that additional countries need to be sort of represented. But we'll need to make that decision fairly early on so that writing teams know exactly what they're focusing on.
On the same thing, I think it's really important. I only know about Germany and Australia, but often people say Australia does this or Germany does that, which is absolutely a blatant lie, because one state does it or one whatever region does it. So I just think it's kind of like in countries like that with such complicated structures, I think it's important to be careful to say, you know, if there's, like in Australia, yes, we have an Australian curriculum, but people use that and say as if that's exactly what all the states and territories do. And those of us in the know that's not true. So I think those kind of things, and then maybe illustrate with some states or whatever with some, you know, a bit of detail, because if you have too much detail, then there's the whole book.
That's right.
But I do think it's got to be located carefully in. Maybe this is the guidance across the whole country, but actually it is different.
We're now going on to section 4, which is going to be just basically a synthesis of the whole book. And of course, we can't really talk about that except sort of very broadly. But the editorial team will deal with that at a later stage. Becoming an author, Stephen, did you want to go back to that?
Column for contributions. So if you are interested, provide some ideas of what you could contribute and to which chapters and proposed chapter teams and author teams. Section 2, call for ideas, again relating to a particular subject, and possibly proposed chapters and author teams where there are multiple proposals, and touch on that. And then chapter 3, in the first instance, I suppose, call for empirical chapters from individual researchers or research teams.
Just one more point that I'd like to make before we do finish up. We are moving ahead on the special issue. We're talking with professional development in education. The special issue would be a 2026 special issue, so it would come after this, but the process will need to begin beforehand. There's been a bit of toing and froing, so Lewis and I've been working on that, and Lewis is leading that special issue. And it also will focus on teacher education, but their remit is very much focused on in-service teacher education, we've been told. So we have to remove the teacher education stuff out, but it doesn't preclude, of course, transition into teaching. So the, you know, that induction processes, for example, could still be included, and its focus is on teacher education and teacher professional learning, professional development. Lewis, did you want to say anything else about that one?
Just thinking it through. Part of the reason why we're looking to do the special issues is to engage a whole lot of stakeholders. And one of the things they mentioned to us as part of their feedback, initial feedback, is that they're encouraging us to go beyond the OOFTAS collection. They're really wanting us to get out more widely as well. So building those networks into professional associations, for example, into international teacher association bodies, all those sorts of things are also looking for us to do.
Yeah.
So,
but there'll be research papers, so people who are
Yes.
teaching, who researching and teaching out of field, but aren't part of the collective, are more than welcome.
part of the collective yet.
Yes, yes, of course. So there are lots of opportunities coming. So it looks like the timing of that special issue is good because we can concentrate on the book and then we can think about the special issue. They do want new research. They're a little bit concerned that, you know, maybe we'll be wanting to publish research that has already been disseminated through the collective or published through our various bits and pieces. But I'm sure we know how to be professional and academic about all of this. We don't republish things that have already been published. So, but what that means though, is that if you want part of your research to be captured in a journal article rather than a book, then have a think about what you feel you might contribute to this book as opposed to the special issue. So that's sort of why I've raised it here, because it might actually influence what you contribute and what you put forward in your EOI. I'll set up another page on the TAS Collective website where people can get that information. You'll need to know it, what's in scope with that